Orchestrated fresh American memoir with new characters and financial details. Orchestrated fresh American memoir with new characters and financial details. I found my daughter on a bench outside the Giant Eagle on Detroit Road, and the first thing I noticed wasn't her face. It was the trash bags. Two of them, the black kind you buy in a roll under the kitchen sink, sitting in a snowbank by her boots. She had my granddaughter on her lap with a blanket over both of them, and the wind coming off Lake Erie that February was the kind that gets into the seams of your coat and stays there. I had pulled over before I'd made any decision to. One second, I was driving past with a trunk full of groceries. The next, I was double parked with the hazards on, and I was looking at my own child holding her child in a parking lot, and something in me did not panic. I want to be clear about that because I've thought about it a great deal since. It didn't panic. It went quiet, the way the house goes quiet right before the power comes back on. "Get up," I told her. "Both of you, in the car." She started to talk. She was going to explain it standing there in the cold, the whole tangled thing, and I could see she'd rehearsed some version of it in her head for hours. I held up one hand. "Not here," I said. "You can tell me everything once you're warm." She lifted my granddaughter onto her hip, and I grabbed both trash bags myself, one in each hand, and I did not let my face do a single thing, because if there's one skill 35 years of my work gave me, it's the ability to keep my expression flat while my mind is moving very, very fast. My name is Maureen Brandt. I'm 68 years old, and I spent most of my life as a forensic accountant. People hear that and picture a calculator. What it actually means is that for 3.5 decades, companies and law firms and once or twice the federal government paid me to find money that someone had worked very hard to hide. Embezzlement. Cooked books. Husbands who swore under oath they were broke, while a condo in Scottsdale sat under a shell company's name. I was good at it. I was good at it the way some people are good at crossword puzzles. It scratched something in my brain the moment when a number that didn't belong finally explained itself. I retired 4 years ago. I have a quiet house in Rocky River, a good pension, a garden I fuss over too much, and I genuinely believed the most strenuous thing left in my life would be the homeowners association. My daughter is 34. She is the better version of me, softer, more forgiving, quicker to assume the best of people. When she was 9, she spent her own birthday money buying a winter coat for a girl in her class whose family was having a hard year, and she didn't tell me until I found the receipt. And when I asked her why, she just shrugged and said the girl was cold. That's who she is. That's who she still is. She married 7 years ago, and I liked her husband well enough. He was polite, he was steady, he held doors. He had the slightly anxious quality of a man raised by someone who corrected him a lot, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I should have. The thing I have learned, slowly and at cost, is that the way a grown man flinches usually tells you everything about who taught him to. His mother is named Glenda Pruitt. I'll try to be fair to her because I think fairness matters even when, especially when, it isn't deserved. Glenda is the kind of woman who runs a family the way an air traffic controller runs a tower. Nothing lands without her say-so. She lives in a big brick colonial in Bay Village that her late husband paid for, and she has spent the last 20 years arranging the lives of everyone connected to her by blood or marriage, always smiling, always reasonable, never once raising her voice. From the day my daughter and her husband got serious, Glinda made it understood, never out loud, always through logistics, that this new family belonged to her. The holidays were at her house. The decisions ran through her. When my daughter got pregnant, it was Glenda who happened to know the right pediatrician, the right preschool, the right everything. I said something once, early on. My daughter asked me gently to let it go because she was happy and the baby was healthy and she didn't want a war between her mother and her mother-in-law. So I let it go. I told myself it was respect for my daughter's marriage. It was cowardice dressed up as respect, and I will carry that. Here is the detail that mattered, the one I noticed at the time and filed away and did nothing about, which is its own kind of failure. When my daughter and her husband bought their house in Lakewood, my daughter put in $75,000. That was real money to her. It was her savings from before the marriage, plus a chunk her father had left her when he passed, and she was proud of it. Glinda contributed $30,000 toward the down payment, and that contribution came with a condition that no one ever said aloud, but everyone understood. Glenda's name went on the deed. Her son's name went on the deed. My daughter's name did not. She was told it was a financing thing, something about credit, about the mortgage company, about keeping it simple, and Glenda would fix it later. I knew what that meant the second I heard it. The way you know a sound in your house at night is the furnace and not a person. I knew, and I let my daughter believe it was paperwork because she wanted so badly to believe she was building something solid, and I couldn't bring myself to be the one who told her the floor wasn't there. That was a little over 3 years before I pulled over on Detroit Road. In the car, with the heat blasting and my granddaughter already drifting off against her mother's coat, my daughter told me what had happened. She told it the way people tell you something they're still trying to make sense, out of order. Circling back, apologizing for crying, the short version is this. She and her husband had been struggling for about a year. There'd been distance, arguments that ended in silence, the slow administrative collapse of a marriage where two people stop reaching for each other. She'd suggested counseling. He'd agreed and then never made the appointment. 2 weeks before I found them, he told her he wanted to separate. She said okay. She said she wanted to do it like adults, for the sake of our girl. She thought they were going to have a hard, sad, civilized conversation about how to split a life. Instead, on a Tuesday morning, Glinda showed up at the house at 8 o'clock with a locksmith. My daughter came downstairs to find her mother-in-law standing in the kitchen, calm as anything, explaining in a voice you'd use to read a grocery list that since the house was in Glenda's name and her son's name, and since the marriage was over, my daughter no longer had any right to be there. She'd already talked to a lawyer, she said. My daughter had no legal standing. She should take what she needed for a couple of days and go. She asked about her daughter. Her husband, who had stayed upstairs through the whole thing, who could not even come down to do this himself, finally appeared and said their girl would stay with him, with his mother, that they'd figure out the schedule through the lawyers. My daughter, standing in her own kitchen in her socks while a stranger drilled out her locks, did the only thing her body would let her do. She grabbed our granddaughter, who was crying now and didn't understand, and she grabbed a one-eared stuffed rabbit off the couch because the baby wouldn't leave without it, and she put the two of them in trash bags because there was nothing else, and the locksmith was already changing the back door. She didn't take her own things. She took the baby's things. That's who she is. And then she sat in the cold for an hour and a half, she told me, because, and this is the part where something went very still and very cold in my chest, she couldn't reach me. Months earlier, her husband had moved the whole family onto one of those bundled phone plans, his mother's plan, and somewhere in that migration, my number had come off my daughter's phone. She knew it by heart, she said, but she was shaking and the baby was screaming and her mind had gone blank the way it does, and she sat there trying to remember her own mother's phone number and couldn't until finally she walked to the grocery store because it was warm and she could think. And she sat on that bench and waited and I happened to drive by. She deleted me, I said, out loud, mostly to myself. I don't know if it was on purpose, my daughter said. I looked out the windshield at the parking lot. A man was walking his cart back to the corral instead of leaving it in the lot in February for no reason except that it was the decent thing to do. I watched him do it. "Okay," I said, "you're coming home, both of you, and I want you to listen to me, because I am only going to say this once. You did nothing wrong, and this is not over. My house has 4 bedrooms and exactly one person living in it, which had always seemed like a quiet kind of foolishness until that night when it suddenly seemed like the most sensible decision I'd ever made. I had the guest room ready in under an hour. I have a pot of beef and barley soup in my freezer at all times because that's how my own mother raised me, and my granddaughter ate 2 bowls of it standing on a kitchen chair, and then I gave her a bath and put her in one of my old cardigans that came down past her knees, and she thought that was the single funniest thing that had ever occurred in the history of the world. She fell asleep at 7:30 with the one-eared rabbit jammed under her chin. My daughter sat at my kitchen table and cried until she ran out, and I let her, and I made tea, and I didn't say a word until she was done, because some things you cannot fix, and the only honest thing to do is sit there while they happen. Then I asked her one question, the accountant's question. "The 75,000, I said. "The down payment. Do you have anything in writing? Anything at all? An email, a text, a note on a napkin?" She looked at me like she didn't understand. "It wasn't really a deal, Mom," she said. "It was our house. We bought it together." "I know," I said. "Walk me through where the money went. Every dollar." It took us almost an hour, and by the end I had 4 pages of notes on the legal pad I keep in the junk drawer, because some habits don't retire, they just wait. Here's what I had when we were done. My daughter's 75,000 had gone into a joint checking account she shared with her husband, and from there into the down payment on a house she had no ownership stake in. There was no co-ownership agreement, no promissory note, no written acknowledgement that the money was hers. In the eyes of the law, the way it sat right then, my daughter had made a gift, a very large gift, to a man who was now letting his mother drill out her locks. But here's the thing about people who are sloppy with money in one direction. In my experience, and my experience is not small, they are almost never sloppy in only one direction. People who learn to move money quietly do it everywhere. It becomes how they think. And a woman who would put her own name on her son's deed instead of her daughter-in-law's, who would coach that son to keep a wife off the title of her own home, who would show up with a locksmith at 8 in the morning, was not, I would have bet my pension, a woman with clean books. "I need everything," I told my daughter. "Every statement you can still get into, the joint account, anything you ever had access to. Venmo, the credit cards, the old emails, all of it, before they lock you out of those too." "Mom," she said, "I just want my daughter back. I don't want to make this ugly." I held her hand. "Sweetheart," and I almost never call her that, so she looked up. "She changed the locks on you in February with your child inside," I said. "With respect, the ugliness has already been chosen. We're just deciding who has to live in it. She got me into the joint account that night, before anyone thought to close it. I made tea, and I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow highlighter and a reading lamp, and I did the thing I spent my whole life doing. I read. It took 3 evenings, 4 years of statements, line by line, and on the second night I found it. Every month, not the same day, never a round number, the irregular kind of thing your eye slides right past. There was a transfer out of the joint account, sometimes $900, sometimes $1,400, going to an account I didn't recognize, not to Glenda's personal account, which would have been obvious, to an account labeled only with a name I didn't know. Over 5 years, those little transfers added up to just under $71,000. My daughter, when I showed her, went white. She had never seen them. Her husband handled the business stuff, she said. His mother had set up the household budget when they got married to help them get on their feet, and they just never changed it. I wrote down the account name and the routing number. The next morning, I did what a forensic accountant does, which is mostly just knowing where the public records are and not being afraid of a form. The name on that account belonged to a limited liability company registered in the state of Ohio. I pulled the filing from the Secretary of State's website. It costs nothing, anyone can do it, and almost no one ever does. The LLC had been formed 6 years earlier. Its registered agent, its sole listed member, was Glenda Pruitt. I sat back in my kitchen chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. Outside, the snow was coming down in that soft, patient way it does in the worst part of an Ohio winter, like it has nowhere to be. $71,000, quietly drained out of my daughter's marriage, 1,000 at a time, into a shell company her mother-in-law controlled, while my daughter clipped coupons, while she put off the dentist, while she told me more than once that money was tight and she didn't understand why, because she and her husband both worked. That was the moment, if you want to know, that I called Sandra. Sandra Krause and I have known each other for 30 years. She is a family law attorney here in Cuyahoga County, one of the best. And I say that even though I could not stand her for the first decade I knew her, because she was always right and never quiet about it, we've buried that hatchet several times over. I laid it all out for her on the phone, the deed, the down payment, the LLC, the transfers. She was silent for a moment, which, from Sandra, is the equivalent of a standing ovation. "The down payment we can work with," she said finally. "Unjust enrichment, constructive trust. If we can show that 75 was a contribution to a joint asset and not a gift, a court can impose a trust over her share of the equity." That's real. The transfers, that's potentially fraudulent transfer, and if those funds were marital and she was siphoning them out ahead of a separation she'd been planning, that's worse than real. Maureen, she said my name the way she used to in 1994 when she was about to tell me I'd missed something. "What do you actually have?" "Documents, not a theory, documents." "I've got 35 years of finding what people bury," I said. "Give me 2 weeks." What I found in 2 weeks was more than even I expected. Because I couldn't help myself, I ran Glenda Pruitt's history. Not anything improper. Court records are public, you just have to know the dockets. And there it was, a previous matter, almost 19 years old. Glenda had another child, a son, older than my daughter's husband. That son had been married once before, years ago. And when that marriage ended, the ex-spouse, a man named Del Hartman, who lives now in Tucson, had alleged something in the divorce filings that stopped me cold when I read it. Marital funds, Hartman claimed, had been moved into a company account he could never get a clear accounting of. The case settled out of court. Hartman walked away with far less than he should have, and I sat there in Sandra's office with the old filing printed out between us, and I understood that I was not looking at a desperate woman who'd made one terrible choice in a hard month. I was looking at a method, a practiced one. "She's done this before," Sandra said. "She's done this before," I agreed. "And she did it again because it worked, and because every time she counted on the other person not knowing what they didn't know." We filed 3 things, and we filed them on the same day, which I'll admit gave me a satisfaction I'm not entirely proud of. The first was a civil action for unjust enrichment and a constructive trust over my daughter's contribution to the house, the full 75,000 and her share of the appreciation since. The second was a claim for fraudulent transfer, to claw back the $71,000 routed into Glenda's LLC, on the theory that the funds were marital property moved to defeat my daughter's interest in advance of a separation Glenda had clearly been planning. The third was Sandra's idea, and it was the one that drew blood. Under Ohio law, you cannot simply change the locks on a person who lives in a home and call it done. Self-help eviction, a lockout without a court order, is illegal, and it carries statutory damages. Glenda had walked into an occupied home with a locksmith and removed a resident and a child by force of intimidation, and she had done it while telling my daughter a lie that she'd already spoken to a lawyer. And my daughter had no legal standing, a lie designed specifically to keep a frightened woman from getting advice of her own in the one window where advice mattered most. We had strong reason to believe Glenda had never spoken to any lawyer at all. We made sure the court knew it. I was not in the room when Sandra served her. I had my daughter take our granddaughter to the children's program at the library that morning, and I drove down to the lakefront and walked along the water by myself. It was the middle of March by then, and the ice on the lake was breaking up, those huge gray slabs grinding and shifting against each other with a sound like the world clearing its throat. I stood and watched it for a long time. I thought about my own mother, who never once raised her voice and whom not one person in our neighborhood ever crossed twice. I thought about my daughter at 9 years old buying a coat for a cold girl. I thought about my granddaughter asleep in a cardigan 3 sizes too big with a one-eared rabbit. My phone buzzed. It was Sandra. 2 words. Done. She went pale. I put the phone back in my coat pocket and stayed and watched the ice a while longer. The next 4 months were not clean, and I won't pretend they were, because I think it does real harm to people in the middle of something like this when they hear a tidy story and feel like failures for living a messy one. There were days my daughter wanted to drop all of it, when she said maybe she was the one making it a war, when she sat at my table at midnight and asked me whether fighting back was turning her into something she didn't want to be. There were days her husband called her crying. And here's the part I did not expect, the part that complicated everything in a way I've come to think was the truest part of all. As it unraveled, it became clear that my son-in-law had not known about the LLC. Not really. His mother had set up the household finances when they married, and he had simply never looked, the way some people never look, because looking would mean knowing, and knowing his mother was robbing his own marriage was more than he could hold. He had been managed his whole life. He'd been raised by a woman who corrected him until he flinched. That doesn't excuse what he let happen on that Tuesday morning. He stayed upstairs while his wife was put out in the snow, and I will never fully forgive that. But it explained the shape of him. He'd married a kind woman and stood by while a cruel one decided his life because no one had ever taught him. He was allowed to say no to his mother. My granddaughter, through all of it, came to my house every other week, and then more, once the temporary custody order put her with her mother. She started calling my kitchen table the soup table. She developed strong, detailed opinions about which of my mugs were correct for hot chocolate. One evening she told me, with the gravity of a small judge, that my house smelled like soup and library books, and that this was the best smell. And I told her it was the nicest thing anyone had said to me in a very long time, and I meant it more than she'll ever know. Glenda hired a real attorney this time. The negotiation took the better part of 3 months, and there were stretches where I honestly could not have told you how it would land, and I am not a woman who says that lightly. But here is how it ended. The constructive trust claim resulted in a court order returning my daughter's $75,000 plus her share of the equity, a little over $91,000 all told, secured against the house. The fraudulent transfer claim resulted in the LLC repaying $64,000 of the $71,000 into the marital estate to be divided as part of the divorce, which meant the bulk of it came back to my daughter. The illegal lockout claim settled with statutory damages and, more importantly, with an admission on the record of what had been done, which mattered to my daughter more than the money, because for months Glenda's whole strategy had been to make her feel as though she'd imagined it. I want to be precise about the rest, because I think precision is a form of respect for the truth. Glenda Pruitt was not arrested. What she did was, in the strict legal sense, a civil wrong and not a criminal one, and the system treated it accordingly, and I have my own private opinions about whether that's right that I'll keep to myself because they're mine and not the court's business. People asked me after, and a few of them were angry on my behalf, why she wasn't charged, why a woman could siphon $71,000 and walk away owing it back with no handcuffs involved. I understand the anger. I felt it too for about a day. But I'll tell you what did happen, and it was not nothing. The fraudulent transfer findings and the pattern we documented going back 19 years to Tucson were enough that the matter got referred to the state attorney general's economic crimes unit, and the last I heard, that file was open and not closed. Glenda's lie about having consulted a lawyer, coupled with documents we found showing she'd drafted and pressed quasi-legal paperwork on her own family for years, drew a referral for the unauthorized practice of law, which in this state is not a parking ticket, and the thing she could not negotiate away, the thing no settlement could give her back, was the family itself. Her older son, the one whose ex-husband sat in Tucson all those years wondering where the money went, read the filings. He read about Del Hartman. He called him. I'm told that conversation lasted 3 hours. My son-in-law slowly, in the halting way of a man learning a language late, stopped taking his mother's calls. The controls she'd spent 2 decades building, the tower from which she'd directed every landing. It came down, not because anyone tore it down, because everyone in it finally got to read the blueprints and saw what she'd been doing while they trusted her and walked out. My daughter got shared custody, real custody, half the week and every other weekend. She used the settlement money as a down payment on a small house in Avon, and this time I checked the deed myself at the county recorder's office, because of course I did. Her name is on it, hers alone. She called me the night she got the keys, and she started to say something and she couldn't, and I told her she didn't have to. We were quiet on the phone together for a minute, the comfortable kind of quiet you can only have with someone you've known their entire life. She would have gotten away with it, my daughter said finally, if it had been anyone else's mother, if I hadn't had you. I thought about that. I thought about a routing number I copied onto a yellow legal pad at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and about Del Hartman in Tucson, who, for 19 years, had no one to copy down the routing number for him. Maybe, I said, but it wasn't anyone else. It was us. I'm not telling you any of this because I want to be admired. I'm 68 years old. I have a garden that needs me and a granddaughter who has opinions about mugs, and I am well past the age of needing anyone to think I'm clever. I'm telling it because I know that somebody hearing this has sat on a cold bench with everything they own in 2 trash bags and either didn't know there was a single number left to call or called it and was told there was nothing to be done. And what I want that person to know, more than anything, is that there is almost always something to be done. Not always enough, not always fast, not always the whole of what was taken, but something. The people who do what Glenda did, and there are more of them than you'd like to believe, in nicer houses than you'd expect, they are all betting on the same thing. They are betting that the person across the table won't understand the paperwork, that the grief and the exhaustion and the sheer weight of starting over will do most of the work for them. that you'll be too tired to find the thing that was buried and too ashamed to ask for help finding it. So find your person, the one who isn't afraid of the documents, the one who'll sit at a kitchen table at midnight with a highlighter and a cold cup of tea and keep reading until the number that doesn't belong finally tells the truth. Maybe it's a lawyer. Maybe it's a friend who's been through it. Maybe it's a stubborn old woman in Rocky River who spent her whole life learning exactly where the bodies get buried in a bank statement. Whoever it is, go find them and let them stand next to you. Because the one thing those people are counting on most of all is that you'll believe you have to face it by yourself. You don't. You never did. That's the whole of what I came here to say. I keep coming back to the trash bags. Not the locksmith, not the LLC, not the day the settlement came through. The bags. Because that's the picture Glinda Pruitt was counting on. She built her whole plan on the idea that a frightened woman with her child and two garbage bags would be too ashamed and too tired to ever look at a bank statement. She was wrong about exactly one thing, and that one thing was me. Nothing that happened to my daughter happened by accident, and nothing that happened to Glinda did either. A woman who moves $1,000 a month into a shell company for 5 years isn't unlucky when it finally surfaces. She's harvesting what she planted. And a young woman who buys a coat for a cold classmate at 9 grows into someone who gets her keys back at 34, because the people who stand beside you when it falls apart are usually the ones you were kind to when you had no reason to be. Cause and effect doesn't take sides, it just keeps the books. If I've learned anything worth handing down, it's that you have to grow three things in yourself all at once, or the other two don't hold. The first is a refusal to do to others what was done to my daughter that February morning, to stay decent even when decency costs you the way she did, the way Del Hartman in Tucson deserved someone to be for him 19 years ago and didn't have. The second is the patience to actually understand a thing in front of you, to read the statement line by line, to pull the public filing, to learn where the money really went instead of accepting the story you're handed. I didn't beat Glenda because I was angry. I beat her because I knew where to look, and knowing is something you build on purpose, one boring Tuesday night at a time. And the third is the plain stubbornness to keep going when it's ugly and slow and your daughter is crying at your table at midnight asking if she should just give up. Goodness without the spine to defend it gets robbed. Knowledge without the grit to use it just sits in a drawer. My granddaughter still thinks the funniest thing in the world is a cardigan that's too big. She doesn't know any of this yet. Someday she will, and when she does, I want her to take one thing from it. Not that her great-grandmother was clever, that the people who try to make you feel small and powerless and alone are always, every single time, betting that you'll believe them. Don't. Stay kind, learn the thing nobody thinks you can learn, and refuse to sit down. You are never as alone or as powerless as they need you to think you are.